Hello, this lecture is on John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an outstanding example of a church leader desiring church reform in the 1300s. His impact was profound, and a group called the Lollards continued his ideas, as did Jan Huss, a preacher and professor in Bohemia. In the era before John Wycliffe, most activities of European communities revolved around the parish. At the parish level, the parish priest administered to the spiritual and everyday needs of the people. The parish priest played a key role in maintaining the quality of Christian life in the parish. Religious symbols and practices were an important component of peasant life. The local populations went to the parish church for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Every family desired the proper baptism of an infant, as it was viewed as necessary for the new birth and thus salvation. Many people believed that if infants died without being baptized, they, still tainted with original sin, could never enjoy heaven. Sunday masses were usually well attended, but the parish church and property were also used for community dancing, games, banquets, festivals, and fairs. As for bishops and abbots, many were involved in both church and secular functions. Bishops were expected to maintain religious duties and carry out governmental services. They filled the roles of royal counselors, treasury officials, and judges. Pious bishops made regular journeys of visitations that allowed them to inspect parishes, record information, encourage the faithful, and discipline the corrupt. But there were serious church shortcomings. Priests were to accept absolute celibacy in theory, and church law required that they maintain high moral standards. In the late medieval period, there was increasing criticism voiced concerning the immoral behavior of the clergy. There were parish priests who had concubines and priests who got drunk, gambled, and participated in other social sins. There were also wandering priests who intruded in parishes. They administered the sacraments in disregard of the local priest. Church regulations concerning the education of priests were not always maintained by bishops. Standards of ordination could be very low. In some cases, priests could barely read and write. Books were scarce and expensive, and illiteracy was the norm, with only a small percentage of people able to read. Preaching was key to teach the people of the basic tenets of Christianity, but a poorly educated priest was not prepared to provide correct biblical teaching. Many bishops and other clerics failed to perform their religious duties. There were bishops who became worldly and did not carry out their spiritual responsibilities. Absenteeism occurred when priests holding official positions in Italy did not set foot in their own diocese. Government officers might be rewarded with high church offices. Thus, rewards would be based on governmental service rather than spiritual leadership. Also, the secular nature of the church was linked to wealth. The luxurious lifestyle of the church elite provided a stunning contrast to the experience of the simple fishermen who were Christ's first disciples. It appeared that the wealthy and powerful church had lost touch with a commitment to holiness. It was long overdue for someone with credibility to speak up. John Wycliffe was one who rose to the challenge of reforming the church. John Wycliffe was born around 1330 in the Yorkshire village of Wycliffe-on-Tees. At the age of about 16, he began study at Oxford University. Oxford was the learned city that was famous all over Europe. Wycliffe studied the 7 liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, logic, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. This he did before moving on to theology, known as the Queen of the Sciences. The language of instruction was Latin. As a gifted student, he became a master of scholastic philosophy and theology. Later, he taught at Oxford, gaining the popular title, the Evangelist Doctor. His clear thinking and logic attracted the attention of many. He was also a serious man, however, who lacked a sense of humor. Wycliffe was a realist who rejected the nominalism of his day. Unlike the realist who believed universals existed independent of the mind of the thinker, nominalists, quote, maintain that only particular things are real and that universals were no more than words coined by the intellect. A realist did not see man as a, quote, figment of the imagination, which the mind constructs to lump together the millions of beings called men, but in itself an entity. Man was an entity, wasn't a figment of the imagination. The application to Christianity is that, quote, the saving work of Christ is for all mankind and not for isolated individual men. And the church is more than the sum of individual Christians or local congregations. Wycliffe gained a reputation for impressive theological scholarship and teaching. Indeed, he had no scholastic equal in contemporary England. 2 major works were On Divine Dominion and On Civil Dominion. His main point was that all legitimate dominion comes from God. Historian Justo Gonzalez offers an excellent summary. Any lordship used for the profit of the ruler rather than for that of the governed is not true dominion, but usurpation. The same is true of any dominion, no matter how legitimate, which seeks to expand its power beyond the limits of its authority. Therefore, any supposed ecclesiastical authority that collects taxes for its own benefit or seeks to extend its power beyond the sphere of spiritual matters is illegitimate. Wycliffe argued that, quote, all ownership is God's and that God grants the use of property on the condition that the holder render faithful service. When there was no faithful service, the use of the property is ended. For example, it was possible that if a churchman misused church property, he could lose the use of it by the authority of a secular power. Wycliffe's popularity grew with his criticism of foreign papal taxation and his promotion of a simpler, more biblical faith. Various popes had demanded annual payment from the crown on the basis that Rome claimed universal supremacy and regarded all monarchs as her vassals. Wycliffe taught that the scriptures are the only law in the church. The church itself is not, as the common man imagines, centered in the pope and the cardinals. It is the whole company of the elect. Its only certain head is Christ, since the Pope may not be one of the elect. Wycliffe did not oppose the office of the papacy, but he stressed that the true head of the church was Christ. Yes, church could have an earthly leader, but he needed to be like Peter and strive for the simplicity of early Christianity. The point was that hopefully a pope is one of the elect. But when a pope seeks worldly power, one must be cautious. Wycliffe wanted the Roman church at all levels to act biblically. Of course, it was provocative when Wycliffe argued that popes could be an error and that they were not necessary for the administration of the church. A worldly pope was a heretic who did not deserve to hold office. In fact, Wycliffe declared that the claim to authority by popes and bishops was founded on false ideas. Moreover, salvation was a gift from God and was not based on participation in rituals or the mediation of the priesthood. As one historian explains, Wycliffe held that the true church is made up only of those elected by God and is invisible, and that since it is God's choice which determines membership, no visible church or its officers can control entrance or can exclude from membership. End of quote. Wycliffe believed that personal merit had greater importance than rank and office, and he promoted the ideas of eliminating immoral clergymen and reducing the property of the church. Church elites found this notion dangerous since it undermined their power. In England, civil authorities who questioned the heavy-handedness of popes welcomed Wycliffe's views. In the mid-1300s, there were a series of English statutes limiting the power of the Pope. One example was having elections for church positions without the interference of the Pope. Wycliffe's greatest contribution was translating the Vulgate Bible into English, which his followers continued after his death. This was before the printing press, and scholars wrote out copies of the Wycliffe Bible. Wycliffe asserted that the Bible, instead of the church, was the sole authority for the believer, and the church should model itself after the pattern of the New Testament. And while this was all occurring, there was the Great Western Schism, and that is an unfortunate chapter of church history where you had more than one pope at one time. So there was competing popes. So Wycliffe then was asserting the importance of the Bible and the importance of there being accountability with high church office. And this, of course, resulted in certainly ruffled feathers. Now, one contested point was Wycliffe's opposition to the dogma of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation was the belief of the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist. This was the position of the Roman Church. Wycliffe held that the substance of the elements was indestructible and that Christ was spiritually present in the sacrament and was apprehended by faith. Now, if adopted, Wycliffe's view would mean that the priest could no longer withhold salvation from one by withholding the body and blood of Christ in the communion. Wycliffe's last years were difficult. Rome condemned his ideas that contradicted official dogma. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI had issued 5 bulls against him, including one sent to the University of Oxford. University leaders did not support Wycliffe. Many at Oxford declared him a heretic. So while he was very popular in an earlier period, at this stage, there were Oxford officials who were losing patience with Wycliffe and his ideas. In 1381, Wycliffe retired to do parish work at Luttersworth. In this year, he got in trouble when his foes charged that he initiated the first great peasant revolt. Many artisans and laborers rebelled against the government's imposition of the unpopular poll tax of 1380. But Wycliffe had not initiated this. This was false. The following year, Archbishop William Courtenay pushed for the examination of Wycliffe's writing. So there was an examination of what Wycliffe was writing, and the final verdict was that some of his writings were heretical. Wycliffe died in the year 1384, but his legacy continued. In the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, 16th century churchman and historian John Bale wrote praising words. Quote, "John Wycliffe, Englishman, the greatest theologian of his time, held alone for many years the magisterial, as it is called, in teaching and disputing at Oxford. Apart from the truly apostolic life which he led, he far excelled all his fellows in England by his ability, eloquence, and erudition. He was roused by the Spirit of the Eternal Father to stand for his truth in the midst of the darkness of impious locusts as the magnanimous warrior of Jesus Christ. And he became the most invincible organ of his day against Antichrist. He was indeed the most strong Elias of his times to reform all distortions. He was one and the first after the losing of Satan to bring the light of truth in that age of darkness, and who dared upon the whole synagogue of the devil to confess Christ and to reveal the abominable turpitude of the great Antichrist. For he shone like the morning star in the midst of a cloud and remained for many days as a faithful witness in the church. As the radiant sun, he shone in the temple of God, and like incense burning in the fire, he was always of the most irreproachable faith and most absolute attachment to the truth. These were praising words from John Bale, and others echoed a similar assessment. The one reason why many commentators wrote of Wycliffe was that his ideas lived on through the efforts of his disciples, notably the Lollards, also known as the poor priests or the simple priests. They held that the main task of a priest was to preach and not hold civil offices. They wanted the Bible to be available in the language of the people. Their opposition to the worship of images and enforced clerical celibacy were additional positions that upset the church establishment. The Lollards faced persecution, and in the year 1401, Parliament approved a statute that calls for the death penalty for those preaching Lollard ideas. The English Parliament passed another anti-Lollard measure in the year 1406. King Henry V, who resigned from 1413 to 1422, opposed the Lollards. In 1414, the Council of Constance condemned the teachings of Wycliffe and the Lollards, and upon the order of the Pope in 1428, Wycliffe's remains were dug up, burned, and scattered in a stream. So rather remarkable, 3 decades after Wycliffe died, we have a Pope ordering for Wycliffe's remains to be dug up. Wycliffe's ideas were also embraced by others in Europe. In the 1400s, Jan Huss of Bohemia, sometimes you hear the pronunciation Jan Huss, I use both. Jan Huss of Bohemia read Wycliffe's work earnestly. Born in approximately 1370, Huss was raised in humble conditions due to the early death of his father. His mother encouraged him to get an education, and he studied philosophy and theology at the University of Prague. Ordained as a priest, Huss became the dean of the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Prague, and also the rector of the Chapel of the Holy Innocents of Bethlehem, also located in Prague. Huss desired moral reform in the church, and he copied in his own hand some of Wycliffe's teachings. Huss was critical of the church and argued that Christ, rather than Peter, was the foundation on which God had founded the church. Critical of the evils of the church, he declared that many of the popes had been heretical. It is important to point out that Huss's motivation was high ethical purpose rather than ecclesiastical revolution. Huss's position on indulgences caused a stir. Indulgences, defined as a freeing or a pardon from all or part of the temporal, that is, earthly punishment, still due for sin after the guilt has been forgiven. I'll read that again. Indulgence, a freeing from all or part of the temporal punishment still due for sin after the guilt has been forgiven. Hus argued that the selling of indulgences for church financial gain was wrong. Much to his disgust, the new Pisan Pope, John the 23rd, permitted the selling of indulgences to raise money for his opposition to the King of Naples. Hus also angered the Pope when he refused to surrender his writings of Wycliffe to the Archbishop of Prague. The Pope demanded action against Hus and the university, and to ease the tension, Hus left Prague, visiting and preaching in other cities. Hus was assured of his safety to attend the Council of Constance. This was a meeting of church leaders at Constance, Germany. So he was assured of the safety to attend the Council of Constance to defend his ideas. But the council, driven to root out what they believed was heresy, first imprisoned Hus and later burned him to the stake. Hus had told the council, quote, "I appeal to Jesus Christ, the only judge who is almighty and completely just. In his hands, I place my cause, since he will judge each, not on the basis of false witnesses and erring counsel, but on truth and justice." He could not recant his ideas to the council, because by doing so, it would offend God and his conscience. The executioners took his ashes and dropped them into a lake to prevent his followers from claiming them as relics. John Wycliffe's impact on Jan Huss and later reformers was immense. Margaret Aston wrote, quote, "In claiming Wycliffe as their spiritual ancestor, Protestant writers looked to him as one who had singularly proclaimed and defended the causes for which they themselves were or had been struggling. Wycliffe's light shone brightly for them in his work, particularly when you think of his work with translating, Bible translation. So his light shone brightly for them in his work as an opponent of the popish corruptions and Romish enormities of his time, against the desolate lives of clergy, monks, and friars, and against miracles, pilgrimages, image, and to their thinking, other errors and abuses. And these endeavors were seen to have been based in the 14th century, as in the 16th, upon a return to the authority of Scripture and the restoration of evangelical standards. John Wycliffe was both celebrated and controversial. His actions and those who adopted his ideas demonstrated the need for church reform. The late medieval church had notable shortcomings, and Wycliffe foreshadowed the Protestant Reformation that began 133 years after his death. So Wycliffe then, a forerunner, a pioneer, that we eventually see the emergence of the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Thank you.